Peter recognizing Jesus as the Messiah, and his failure to understand, or in fact his outright refusal to accept that the Messiah was someone who would suffer and die. And as Wesley was saying last week, this is kind of a turning point for the whole gospel. From that point on, we really are very clearly headed towards the cross. Things kind of take a darker turn. But today we're going to take a break from the narrative flow to home in on the character of Peter as presented in Mark's gospel. As we discussed in week 1 of this series, the author of Mark is unknown, but the title, according to Mark, which you can see on here, depending on how your Greek is, appears on the oldest manuscripts that we have, which actually date back to the 3rd century. An ancient tradition says that Mark was a disciple of the apostle Peter, and that Mark wrote his gospel based on Peter's preaching in Rome. Now, that's the tradition. Papias, bishop of Hierapolis, which is modern-day Turkey, who died around 140 CE, 140 CE, so it's quite early. He wrote of Mark, he wrote down accurately, though by no means in order, as much as he remembered of the words and deeds of the Lord, for he had neither heard the Lord nor been in his company, but subsequently joined Peter. So that's the oldest reference that we have to some guy called Mark writing this gospel and getting his information from Peter. And then about 180 CE, so about 40 years later, Irenaeus, who was the bishop of Lyon in France, wrote something similar. He wrote, after the deaths of Peter and Paul, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, himself also handed down to us in writing the things which Peter had proclaimed. And several other church fathers said similar things around this time, around the end of the 2nd century. And so this was the tradition, the traditional view. This was kind of accepted as, yeah, this is what happened. This is who wrote this gospel for centuries and centuries. But modern scholarship suggests that maybe actually it's not quite that clear. And in fact, it could be unlikely for a number of reasons. Firstly, Peter was an apostle, was a very important figure in the church. And so we would expect a gospel based on his words to be known as the Gospel of Peter, or Testimony of Peter, or something like that. From a literary standpoint, if you do some textual analysis, the author of Mark appears to be drawing from a number of different sources, perhaps some oral sources, and also some written Greek sources. So maybe there wasn't just like one key source. And if Peter had been the main source for Mark, it seems strange that there are certain key stories that are missing from Mark's gospel that feature Peter. For example, Peter walking on water. You think you might want to include that. Or, Peter being named as a disciple who struck the temple servant in the Garden of Gethsemane, and so on. So we can't answer this question, right? We don't know really who wrote the Gospel of Mark. Perhaps the author of Mark drew on oral traditions that were associated with the community that was related to Peter rather than Peter directly. We don't know. Scholars have got lots of different theories on this, and they kind of think about it, get very passionate about their particular theory, but the truth is no one really knows. But what we do know, though, is that Peter is a really important figure in the Gospel of Mark. Peter is named 25 times in this very short gospel. He's the first disciple to be called by Jesus all the way back in chapter 1. And also in that chapter, Jesus goes to Peter's home. He meets his family. He heals his mother-in-law. Peter is part of Jesus's inner circle. Peter, James, and John, it seems, are Jesus's closest friends. Jesus gives them nicknames. They get to accompany Jesus at times when the rest of the 12 are not there. But Peter's not just one of the top 3. He is, he's disciple number 1 in the Gospel of Mark. He's always mentioned first when any of the disciples are named, and he receives a lot more focus. So in chapter 3, Mark gives us the reason why Jesus called Peter and the other guys to be his disciples. We read, he appointed 12 that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. These are the 12 he appointed: Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. To them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. So Peter, together with the other 11, are called by Jesus for 3 reasons. Firstly, to be with Jesus, to be sent out by Jesus to preach, and to have authority over evil forces. I think there's something kind of tender about this. First and foremost, these people are called simply to be with Jesus, to follow him as he travels around, to keep company with him. They're not primarily a workforce. They're not servants, they're friends. And secondary to that, he calls them so that he might send them out to be his representatives and to preach and to exercise authority over evil forces. So this morning, we're going to look at how well Peter kind of measures up to this expectation, these three purposes of being a disciple. So as we mentioned, Peter, or Simon, as he's initially called, meets Jesus in chapter 1. And we read, "As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. 'Come, follow me,' Jesus said, 'and I will send you out to fish for people.' At once they left their nets and followed him." Jesus says, "Come, follow me," or more literally, "Come behind me." Peter does so immediately. He's obedient to Jesus' call, and possibly he's impulsive, although, to be fair, Mark kind of says almost everything was immediately this, that, and the other, so maybe we can't read too much into that. But it seems Peter doesn't hesitate to answer the call. And at the end of chapter 1, we read that Jesus got up early and went to a solitary place to pray. And Peter went looking for him together with his friends. And when he found him, he told Jesus, "Everyone is looking for you." Although we don't want to, assume too much about tone, I don't think you can do that really. He's certainly not apologizing for interrupting Jesus as he's praying. Possibly there's something a little accusatory or a little demanding there, kind of, "We've been looking for you, where have you been?" kind of a thing. Certainly he's someone who's ready to speak his mind, and we'll see more of that as we go on. And Peter seems to be someone who really wants to be with Jesus, which is good because that's the primary reason he was called. And in terms of the other two purposes of discipleship, in terms of being sent out to preach and to exercise authority over evil forces, he, together with the rest of the disciples, seemed to do a pretty good job, according to Mark. We read in chapter 6, "They went out and preached that people should repent. They drove out many demons and anointed many sick people with oil and healed them." Now, Peter's not singled out here, but it seems that the 12 disciples as a group did a pretty good job on their first mission trip. Not 100% success rate, maybe, but they drove out many demons and healed many sick people. That's pretty impressive. But at the same time, as we've been seeing through this series, in the first half of Mark's gospel, all of the disciples are repeatedly portrayed as being fearful and uncomprehending. You might remember in chapter 4, we had the story of Jesus stilling the storm. The disciples were in the boat, and when a storm arose, and they woke Jesus up, and he rebuked the winds and the waves. He told them to be quiet. And then he said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And then there was a second storm in chapter 6 when the disciples saw Jesus walking on the water. And we read, "They thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified." I think you can imagine that scene, right? These big guys, these working men all screaming and losing it, thinking they'd seen a ghost. Not very impressive, not very full of faith. And Mark says that they got in this state not because they didn't understand, because their hearts were hardened. Mark suggests it wasn't just, an intellectual thing that they needed a little bit more explanation. Actually, there was something inside them that was resistant to what Jesus was communicating through his words and his deeds. Then after the feeding of the 4,000 people in Gentile territory that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, the disciples got back in the boat to go home. And we read in chapter 8, "The disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for one loaf that they had with them in the boat. 'Be careful,' Jesus warned them. 'Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod.' They discussed this with one another and said, 'It is because we have no bread.' Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, 'Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? Don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?' 12, they replied. 'And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?' They answered, 7. And he said to them, 'Do you still not understand?'" You can kind of hear the frustration in Jesus's long list of questions for them. Because they had eyes but refused to see. They had ears but they refused to hear. Their hearts were hardened. They were still worried about physical bread, even though Jesus had shown them very dramatically twice that that's not the issue. Even though he'd repeatedly told them that it's what's inside the heart that matters, they were still thinking with their stomachs. Even though he'd shown them that there's enough for all, for Jew, for Gentile, no one is excluded. Even though he demonstrated that God was a God that's characterized by abundant provision, still they were preoccupied with concerns about having to go without, not having enough. And then we get to last week's story, the turning point in Mark's gospel. Peter finally saw, or for just a moment, glimpsed something of who Jesus really is. We read in chapter 8. But what about you? Jesus asked. Who do you say I am? Peter answered, you are the Messiah. But as we were hearing last week, although he figured out that Jesus is the Messiah, his assumptions about what that meant were all wrong. He was still thinking in very earthly terms about political power and taking control by force. He was thinking about a kingdom led by a Messiah who would destroy all of Israel's enemies and exclude anyone but the chosen few. And that's not at all what Jesus was talking about. Immediately after Peter declared Jesus to the Messiah, we read, he then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at the disciples, he rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan, he said. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. What a fall from grace for Peter. 1 minute he's declaring that Jesus is the Messiah, and the next minute Jesus is calling him Satan. I think this is a fascinating story. It's so very human. For once, Peter gets it right? He has a sudden revelation. He gets it. The rest of them didn't get it. He got it. He's made it, his number one disciple. He so gets it that when Jesus starts talking about suffering and dying, Peter's like, whoa, Jesus, can I stop you there? Takes him aside. Can I have a word with you? Man to man kind of a thing. He pulls him to one side and rebukes him, rebukes the person that he has just identified as the Messiah. That's pretty gutsy. Peter so gets it that he doesn't just know who Jesus is. He knows what Jesus should do and how he should behave, apparently better than Jesus does. I love that Mark says Peter began to rebuke Jesus. Probably didn't get too far along that track before Jesus cut him off, I'm guessing. Now, to be fair to Peter, I think he was probably acting from the best of intentions. He clearly loved Jesus. He was committed to him. He left his fishing business, his family, everything behind to come and follow Jesus. But again, he's thinking in earthly terms. If the Messiah is going to crush the enemy and put Israel back on top, as a holy nation, Jesus needs to build coalitions. He needs to get politically savvy. He needs to raise an army. He needs to lock in the loyalty of the masses. Giving them all food, that was a good move. But to start talking about taking up your cross and suffering and dying, nobody wants that. That's not a winning strategy, right? That's not going to get you where you need to go. And of course, Jesus has heard that voice before. That's exactly what he heard when he was being tempted in the wilderness after his baptism. Take the easier, more expedient route. This is the voice of Satan. And Jesus tells him, get behind me. It's almost the same wording that Jesus used when he first called Peter as a disciple. Then he said, come behind me. It has an invitational feel. And now he says, get behind me. Jesus is telling Peter to return to following him, to get back in line. Because disciples don't get to rebuke their leader. Throughout Mark's gospel, Jesus does a lot of rebuking. Actually, he rebukes the wind and waves, he rebukes demons, he rebukes anyone who starts to reveal his identity. But only twice do the disciples rebuke. Here, Peter rebuking Jesus. And in chapter 10, the disciples rebuke the people who bring their children to be blessed by Jesus. And you might remember Jesus got very angry about that. Peter's role is not to rebuke, it's not to correct Jesus or protect or guide Jesus or to set the terms for his discipleship. He doesn't get to say, I'll follow you, but I'm not going to suffer. If he's going to be a disciple, he needs to get back in line, to pick up his cross and follow. And Jesus made sure that all the rest of the disciples also heard that. We're not having any side conversations about what we're willing to do and not willing to do. Jesus is saying boldly and plainly for everyone to hear, if you want to be my disciple, Deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow me. There's no other way. I imagine that that must have been pretty humiliating for Peter. You know, number one disciple, got called out in front of everybody. I wonder what I would have done in his place. Maybe gone home to my family and my business. Maybe burst into tears and ask for forgiveness. I don't know. But we're not told of either of those responses here. Peter doesn't leave, but we're not told that he repents or is sorry or tries to correct anything either. In the following verses at the beginning of chapter 9, which we'll actually come back to in Lent when we take on the second half of Mark's gospel, we read that Jesus led Peter, James, and John up a high mountain. So Peter's still there. He's still part of the chosen three, the closest friends. He's still mentioned first. He hasn't walked away from the group because of being censured. He hasn't been disqualified either. Apparently, he's agreed to get behind Jesus, to go back to following, even if Jesus says that means suffering. And on that high mountain, Jesus was transfigured. He was changed. We read, his clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud, this is my son whom I love. Listen to him. Suddenly, when they looked around, there was no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. So here again, Peter's the one doing the talking. He's blurting something out, not knowing what to say. Although, to be fair, what does one say at a transfiguration? I don't know. I don't know what you're supposed to say. But it seems from what he does say that Peter wants to do something to honor Jesus, even if building a shelter actually is not really called for in the situation. And it seems he wants to be there with Jesus, which is what a disciple is meant to do. But at the same time, it's scary. And if Peter was a source for the writer of Mark, he doesn't mind admitting it. He was frightened. Following Jesus wasn't always a pleasant, easy, kind of comfortable thing to do. It was often scary. We're going to jump forward now to chapter 14, where Jesus has just eaten his last supper with the disciples, and they've gone out to the Mount of Olives. We read, you will all fall away, Jesus told them, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. Peter declared, even if all fall away, I will not. Truly, I tell you, Jesus answered, today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And the others said the same. Oh, Peter, you gotta love this guy, right? He's gutsy. I mean, he got called Satan last time for trying to correct Jesus, and he's doing it again. No, Jesus, you're wrong. I will not run away. Not a lot of humility there, but not a lot of self-awareness. But at the same time, you get the sense that it's coming from a really good place. And he's actually come a long way. He's now willing to admit that Jesus may be killed. And he's willing to be there with him if and when that happens, or so he thinks. He wants to be loyal. He wants to be brave. Jesus knows he's not. But the desire is there. And perhaps Peter thinks that if he says it loud enough and emphatically enough, he really will be that brave. The passage goes on. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to the disciples, sit here while I pray. He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, he said to them. Stay here and keep watch. Going a little further, he fell on the ground and prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. Then he returned to the disciples and found them sleeping. Simon, he said to Peter, are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Many scholars say that Mark has intentionally portrayed Peter in a way that readers will automatically kind of identify with him. And if so, I think he's done a good job. I don't know about you, but I really feel for Peter here. He was emphatic. I will die with you. Actually, he can't even stay awake. And Jesus calls him Simon, a reed, not Peter, a rock. Mark, the narrator, still calls him Peter. He knows the end of the story. But right now, he's not being a rock. And at the same time, though, Jesus graciously assumes the best of him. He recognizes that Peter's spirit is willing. His heart is in the right place. It's just that he's weak. And if you've read this story before, you know that this happens twice more. It must have felt excruciating for all of them. For Jesus, whose best friends can't even stay awake while he's facing, coming torture and execution. But for the disciples too, it must have been so painful, particularly Peter. Peter, who promised to be there, promised to stand by him, can't even stay awake. Mark writes, when Jesus came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him. I bet they didn't. And then, of course, things went from bad to worse for Peter. Judas arrived with a crowd that were armed with swords and clubs, and Jesus is arrested. And Mark says, then everyone deserted him and fled. The disciples did what they promised that they would never do. They stopped following Jesus. They stopped being with Jesus. They fled from him. And then Mark very powerfully records two stories, one after the other, that stand in contrast with one another. And he introduces both of them with these words. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed them at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. So all the disciples fled, we were told that, but Peter apparently returned. He was still following Jesus, albeit at a distance. He wanted to be there. In effect, of all the 12, he's the last man standing. And he was right outside the place where Jesus was being held. Inside, the chief priests accused Jesus of various things, trying to find a way to convict him of a capital crime. We read, again, the high priest asked Jesus, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? I am, said Jesus, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. The high priest tore his clothes. Why do we need any more witnesses? He asked. You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then they began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, prophesy. And the guards took him and beat him. Mark then cuts back to the scene in the courtyard below. And we know that story, right? While Jesus is being questioned about his identity by the high priest, Peter is questioned about his identity by a servant girl. Peter was identified as someone who was with Jesus, the very definition of a disciple, but he denied it. And a second time, the servant girl said, this fellow was one of them. And whereas Jesus inside said, I am, Peter on the outside says, I am not. And while Jesus was being taunted to prophesy outside, his prophecy was coming true. For a third time, Peter denied him, saying with curses, I have no idea who he even is. Back in chapter 8, Jesus had said, being a disciple meant denying yourself. Instead, Peter denied Jesus. Back in chapter 8, Jesus has also said, if anyone is ashamed of me, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them. Peter's threefold denial is the epitome of being ashamed of Jesus. And Mark tells us, immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. Peter's denials of Jesus are his last recorded words in Mark's gospel. How sad is that? He broke down and wept. He expressed deep sorrow. But there's no indication in Mark's gospel that he repented and went back to following Jesus. He's not mentioned at the crucifixion. The women are there, but Peter apparently wasn't. And although he promised to be with Jesus to the very end, it's a different Simon that is around to pick up the cross. Yet Peter is mentioned one more time in this gospel in the last chapter. When the women went to the tomb early in the morning to anoint Jesus' body, they found the stone rolled away. We read, as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. We don't tend to read from Mark's gospel on Easter Sunday because the joy of the resurrection is so muted. The tomb was empty. Jesus had risen, we're told, but everything was still really scary. The women were too afraid to say anything. The male disciples had fled. They'd given up on being disciples. Peter, especially, he denied Jesus. And though it broke his heart, it seemed like, it's all over now. And yet this young man in white said that the women needed to tell Peter specifically that Jesus would meet him. Throughout this gospel, we see the messianic secret, Jesus telling people not to say who he is, and yet they do it anyway. And at the end of the gospel, we see a reversal of that. The women are told to go tell the disciples and Peter, and Mark says they didn't tell anyone. Now, Mark's first listeners would know that couldn't actually be the end of the story. It is the end of the manuscript, but it couldn't be the end of the story. So they know somebody told, right? By this time, Christian communities had sprung up in many different places. Christians were sufficiently well known to be blamed by Nero for the fire in Rome in 64 CE. So those first listeners know that can't be the end. And they're also very likely to know that Peter went on to be a great leader in the church. So perhaps, I don't know how they would have read this. Perhaps they think Mark means that the women told no one on their way to find the disciples, or word about what happened only filtered out later. Who knows? But whatever they assume to be the case, the immediate impact of this story is anticlimactic and it's unresolved. What happened to the women? Did the disciples get the news? More importantly, what happened to Peter? Peter, the number one disciple who knew that Jesus was the Messiah, and then spoke like Satan. Peter, who fell back into line and tried to follow, tried to be loyal and brave, but was weak and failed and fled, gave up on following Jesus. Mark doesn't answer those questions. I think Mark wanted his hearers to be shocked into reflecting personally on this ending and asking questions like, what are we going to do with this story? Are we going to give in to fear? Are we going to run away and not tell anyone like they did? Surely not. We have to tell. We have to do what they couldn't do. We have to be the disciples who stay with Jesus, who share the good news, who stand up to evil forces. I think Mark also wanted his hearers to know it's okay to be scared. Life can be hard and frightening and dangerous. In the mid to late 60s, when this gospel seems to have been written, Christians faced brutal persecution in the Roman Empire. Jesus' resurrection, as joyful and amazing and transformative as it was, did not make life easy, didn't make it a bed of roses. I think Mark wanted his hearers to know, yes, life can be very hard. And sometimes we will fail really, really badly, all of us, even the best of us, like Peter. But that won't disqualify us. Jesus won't give up on us. There is always hope for a fresh start. There's always another opportunity to come back. And not just come back, but grow and learn and become better people, better disciples. Just like Peter. Jesus has called us as his friends. He wants us to live in his company. We've just celebrated Thanksgiving. And something I really love about Thanksgiving is that it happens in late November. And in most years by late November, the leaves have turned brown, they've died, the ground is increasingly hard, the days are getting colder, the nights are long. Thanksgiving looks towards winter, looks towards hard days ahead, and gives thanks. We don't wait for spring to give thanks. We give thanks now, not because we're living in denial, say, oh, winter's not coming, but we're thankful that we have what we need to make it through. The gospel doesn't claim everything is well with the world. There is death as well as resurrection. There are lows as well as highs. But even at the very lowest times, we're not alone. Jesus is with us. Peter's story doesn't end in Mark chapter 16. In some ways, that was just the beginning. And there would be many more ups and downs along that road that Peter walks. But it's a road that he walked with Jesus right to the end. So I want to encourage us this morning to embrace courageous gratitude, to give thanks not just for what we have, although we have so much, but also for what we've learned to live without. for what we've come through and for the people who've been there for us as we've come through it, for the person that we're becoming, because Jesus hasn't given up on us. We're going to take communion in a moment, and different churches have different traditions, but our practice is to take communion every week. And I love that because it means that every week there's an opportunity to perform a very simple act that represents saying yes to Jesus, coming back to Jesus, agreeing to be with Jesus, recommitting to be a follower of Jesus. And we do that symbolically, sharing a meal, as friends do. And there are other ways to respond as you do. You can light a candle, give a gift, go to the stations at the side, write out a prayer. All those are listed on the front of your flyer if you're unfamiliar with those. But before we do move into this time of response, let's just say a prayer. Jesus, I thank you so much that you don't give up on us, none of us, that you love us way, way too much for that. I thank you that you know each of us, you know our hearts, you know where we're at, and you love us, and you want us to be with you, to live life with you. I thank you that you believe in us, that you trust us, you empower us, you just want us for your own. I thank you for that. Amen. When you're ready, please come and take communion.